Hi, my name is Alex. Welcome to Beliefs Bazaar. In this video, I'd like to start delving into a topic that I find very interesting and will be a major focus of my content on this channel, and why I think it relates to many things that are happening in the world today. And specifically, I'm talking about what I think is the actual truth behind a lot of the Bible and other holy texts throughout the world. And there's when thinking about this, and I'll use the example of Jesus because I think most of my audience is going to end up, I live in America, so chances are that most people watching this, if they are religious, will be Christian. So I'm going to use the Bible and Jesus as an example for many of these things. So in this context, there's a phrase that I really like that I think explains a lot of perhaps misinterpretations of things, and the phrase is, the teacher can only explain a concept from their level of understanding. Meanwhile, the student can only understand from theirs. So in the context of Jesus, everyone has no problem admitting that Jesus was an enlightened person and he had arcane and profound wisdom. And oftentimes, the things that he said can be interpreted a number of ways, and that's because we, as the listeners or readers, as the case is, we are not in the mind of Jesus, so we don't know whether or not he meant this thing or that thing, and he's not here for us to ask, so it's really hard for us to really grasp that. And so, oftentimes people talk about the mind of God, or, in the same terms as like the mind of Jesus is the mind of God, and what have you. So, and then oftentimes people will also say, well, we can't fully comprehend the mind of God because they are so much bigger than us, or more, or Jesus is enlightened, so we can't possibly understand things on the level that he does. And that's a fairly common thread throughout holy texts, is that we have a Messiah type character who has what we consider a more expanded mind and more insight and everything into the nature of reality and what they have to say about God, or what have you. And so we're left to interpret what we think it means based on our best experiences or whatever. And so that that's why potentially we look up to pastors or preachers and other holy figures, because we consider them to have a better understanding of the true sentiment behind some of these messiahs. And so what is it to be enlightened? There's many interpretations of even what that means, but for me, and having been through some of these experiences myself, I consider the ego dissolution or ego death in terms of psychedelics as a potential window into what it is to be enlightened. And there's several paths to this perception. Of course, proponents of meditation will say that you can reach these states through deep meditation and meditative practices. There's also psychedelics, of course, near-death experiences, and other spontaneous religious experiences. These have all been shown to be very similar, or at least the testimonies that people give about these experiences all seem to have the same kind of flavor, or the same many similarities that are, in my opinion, something that we shouldn't overlook. And why psychedelics are important in this equation is because in recent years we've had technology that can actually monitor what's happening in our brain, and so we've had brain scans of people that are on psychedelics or in deep meditation. These people, like certain monks in various places, have allowed themselves to be scanned while they're in deep meditation. And while we can't really have someone in a scanner during a near-death experiences, because those are rather spontaneous, as well as these kind of random spiritual experiences, the ones that we have been able to monitor have shown remarkably similar brain activity. So that tells me a couple things. One, that these experiences are all human in nature and are achievable by, anyone that's a human has the potential to experience some of these things, and many do. And so for myself, and of course I'm not unique in this, but there's been many people throughout the years, again including myself, that have had one of these rather transcendent experiences where the ego is more or less not present, and we feel this vast connectivity to every living thing, or we feel like we understand God, or some people who have, have religion in their, their framework, are interpreted through religious iconography and other aspects. But those who aren't religious experience it in a different way. But all these experiences tend to have, kind of like I said, the same flavor, or rather the same like takeaways, and a lot of that, I think, is the reason why these things are so misinterpreted, is because that is a rather that's a pretty novel experience, and not as many people have it as I wish that would. And so, if we had someone in the past, let's say, who have one of these experiences, and even nowadays we don't even really have, in my opinion, adequate language to really describe what these experiences are truly like until you actually experience it yourself. And so you must consider that thousands of years ago, we had even less useful language to describe these things. And so oftentimes, if someone were to have this experience, let's say Jesus, for example, and he's trying to explain to people that in this mental state, or this, space within us, in the, you could say the spiritual realm, how would you explain that to someone who only has the language of the time and is grasping at straws to say, like, well, what do you mean by that? Does that, when you say this connectivity and this feeling and this presence that you feel, or sometimes even interacting with an entity, or some, sometimes aspects of ourselves, if you're explaining that to someone who does not have that experience or vocabulary, they might be like, so what do you mean, like God? Is that what God is, or whatever, and or the kingdom of heaven, or what have you? And the enlightened person might be like, sure, like that is a way to interpret it, sure. And to varying degrees of usefulness, I think people have used the language of the time to try to explain these things. So anyway, moving on, I think there's various terms that people use to describe these heightened mental states. Sometimes people call it enlightenment. Sometimes people call it the Christ consciousness, nirvana. There's many terms for the same kind of thing, in my opinion. Or, in psychedelic terms, it's the ego death, or ego dissolution is how I prefer to describe this. And so, having had a rather powerful ego dissolution experience myself, I came back from that really feeling kind of like I understood the sentiments of a lot of these holy figures, and I kind of felt their frustration in trying to explain that to someone who hasn't had that experience. And one of the main things that I felt I had experienced, not only was it fairly visually enthralling, where I saw things that many people might interpret as angels. I believe there's some parts in the Bible, I think Ezekiel, in describing angels as these things with all these eyes or wings, or, what some people describe as, like, in these days, some people say they've seen like an alien spaceship, and the descriptions sound very similar. Now, my personal experience, which I'll explain in another video, was not necessarily interpreted to me as an angel, although I can see that if I was religious or had that background or framework, that I would absolutely describe that as an angelic apparition, or interaction, if you will. And so I really think that these holy books are essentially an enlightened person, or someone who has had this ego dissolution experience, trying to explain it to someone, and then that person either writing it down or trying to explain it to another person who wrote it down, because we know that most of these books were not actually penned by the messiahs that are featured in them. Although I believe the Quran is said to have been authored by Muhammad, although we have as much evidence for that as we do to say that Jesus was an actual person and that he said these things. Now, I do believe that there were real people who said these things, and then they were either written down directly, and then we've interpreted them a myriad of ways since then, or, the person that heard it was like, well, that's fascinating, and I'm going to write that down how I understood it. So a lot of these things I think are lost in translation from the original intention of what the Messiah was saying. And the example that I'll use, I'll pull up on the screen here, is a from Luke chapter 17, verse 20. The kingdom of God is within you, or in the original Greek, it's more directly translated to the kingdom of God is within or is in your midst, meaning either among us already, or sometimes. And actually, I'll read here because there's a couple interpretations. The within you interpretation is regarding an inner spiritual reality, where this view holds that the kingdom of God is a transformation that begins within the heart and the mind of individuals when they accept God's rule and love. Or the presence in your midst could refer to this interpretation emphasizes that Jesus himself, in his person and actions, was the manifestation of God's kingdom. So he is saying that the manifestation of God's kingdom, are in your midst or around you. And there's also the among you interpretation, where this translation suggests that the kingdom is found in the midst of the community of believers as they live out God's will and love for others. And then I'd like to read this key takeaway. Regardless of the exact translation, the core message is that the kingdom of God is not a distant future event to be awaited, but a present reality that is already beginning to manifest in the hearts and lives of individuals and communities. It signifies a fundamental change in human nature, bringing inner peace and a way of living that reflects God's love and truth. And, again, these books have all been written by people who have, maybe their own intentions or agenda, and are relating them in a way that kind of makes these things, I guess, finite or specific to individuals, or to say that, like, God is an actual entity and only he can bestow upon you these states of being or what have you. But having gone through a chemically induced state of, I guess you could say, revelation even, I feel that all of these conditions, and of course you can reach them by meditation, and so that's what these practices come from, where various religious practices include meditation or some sort of ritualistic endeavor. But ultimately, I believe that is all training to induce a state of ego reduction or ego dissolution even, whereby you no longer really have a true sense of self, and you feel little to no difference between you and another person or human. Or even, even deeper into that is this transcendent feeling where you could easily interpret that as God if you have no other context for what that even might be. And for me, I think it's actually going down to kind of the root of our humanity, because in this state, the idea of being violent towards another person is just absurd. It's not even a sentiment that you would have in this condition. And so that's why I think, like, the idea of love and well-being, or what was the quote here, the bringing of inner peace and love amongst humans or towards other humans. I think that is the, when you reduce your ego sufficiently, we no longer have these barriers that we've built up as we've learned and lived through our lives and learned how to survive and learned what's dangerous and stuff. We create these mental barriers within our mind that kind of distinguish us from other people. And when you break down those barriers, you feel this sense of overwhelming connectedness. And, you could call that God, I guess, because we don't really have another good way to describe that. And so that's why I think instead of there being a omnipresent God or spiritual figure that goes around and touches people in different parts of the world, and, those are, I think this is a common, or at least maybe not so commonly experienced, but an experience that all humans can have. And so that those of us that do, and I'm including myself in this because I feel I've had a number of experiences that could qualify for this, because I'm left with this understanding that these people who have these experiences then try to relate it to their fellow people, or, in their community and stuff. And then those sentiments are all kind of translated through the culture of the area, right? So that's why there's such similarities in all these holy books, is because there are people who have had these ego dissolution experiences, And as humans, they all tend to be kind of the same. And then, of course, it's filtered through our culture and then expressed in ways that are unique to those cultures. So it might seem like this god over here in India or whatever is giving somewhat of a different message than the Christian God over here. It's mostly just a different interpretation based on the culture of the time. And then further down the line, people that are potentially further from that unifying experience, further add to it their desires and agenda, if you will, for how they want these books to be interpreted and the behaviors that they want to induce with that. And so for me, a lot of the behaviors, or rather the suggested behaviors in these holy books, I think are absolutely the sentiments and opinions of the authorship of those books, not necessarily the messages portrayed by the Messiah, because you can always put words in the mouth of someone who isn't right there to explain themselves or correct you. And so in the context of ancient civilizations, if you wanted to, let's say, control a population a little bit more, you can take a message that's universally understood, or at least universally relatable, and then say that the only path to this thing is to behave in a certain way. And so by that route, if you have a civilization or a community or whatever, and you want people to behave in a certain way, it's hard to just say like, hey, I think you should behave like this. And a person can be like, well, who are you to tell me to behave like this? That's absurd. But if you can convince everyone that actually, no, there's a supreme being and that you might not care what I think, but if you don't want to upset that supreme being, you won't do this or that, And so again, I think this universally understood or relatable message is then taken and distorted, even perverted in many cases, to induce some sort of behavioral conformity or what have you. If you are afraid of not getting into this eternal blissful existence after you die, and somehow you'll be punished if you act outside of these parameters, then of course that might induce people to self-police themselves or regulate their own behavior. And in many cases, this is for the good of the community, because you want people to be thinking about the greater impact of their decisions. But most of the time it comes down to personal desire to either not be punished or to achieve some sort of thing that they look forward to. So people will self-regulate their own behaviors in this way. I will be focusing on this more so in future content. I just wanted to kind of express this idea to get started on this topic. And ultimately, these sentiments that many people who are of various faiths say that they look to, and this is like how humans should act, and this is really what's best for our communities and how to treat each other. I agree. There's many sentiments within these holy books that do just that. And, the love thy neighbor, for example, or the golden rule, do unto others. These are useful things. And I don't necessarily think that we need religious context to express them or believe them. We just need the desire to create a better world for ourselves and those around us in our community, or even outside of our community, to think of things in a greater context of like worldwide. How do we want people to be experiencing life, And that's, I think, kind of the underlying tenets of humanism, is what's best for the most people, what reduces suffering and increases prosperity for the most people. And I don't think we need religion to do that. Although if you're already religious, I'm not asking anyone to discard their ideology or anything. I just think that we should focus more on what's good for everyone around us and not use these things to draw lines or division between any groups of people. And yeah, so that's kind of where I want to be going with this. And again, real quick, if I wasn't explicit before, like humanism or secular humanism is the idea that we should do what's best for the most people and try to reduce suffering for the most people possible, and even increase the prosperity for as many people as possible. So yeah, that's kind of all I had to say about it in this video. I will be delving into this more, and even eventually I'd like to start pulling quotes from messiahs like Jesus and other people in other holy books to show the similarities and talk about the shared sentiment and possible lessons on how we should be living and how we should be treating each other. And I know my channel is brand new and I don't have many viewers yet, so if you would be so kind as to subscribe or even share this video with people, I'll be delving further into these when I have, if I have more viewers, I'll be taking more time to actually get into the specifics and do more research and really kind of narrow down what I want to express and relate. And hopefully all of you will join me on that journey, or perhaps you already have if you are someone who has experience with psychedelics or other religious experiences. You may already understand what I'm saying, and whether or not you can articulate it, I hope to be able to do so. And like I said, if the more people that are watching and enjoying this content, the more time I will be investing into it and actually having better reference materials. And I'll maybe write some scripts so I don't stumble over my words so much and what have you. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate anyone who's watching this video. Yeah, if you share these sentiments, that please give it a like even, and let me know in the comments if you'd like me to focus on anything specific or any messages from any of these holy texts that you'd like me to specifically focus on for any future video. So thanks again. See you later.